In recent months, actress Rachel Ziegler has found herself the object of sustained derision from a subset of online media personalities whose livelihoods are structured around the manufacture and maintenance of cultural grievance. Ziegler's association with Disney's live-action Snow White has rendered her a convenient vessel for anxieties less about her person than about the symbolic terrain she is presumed to inhabit. Figures such as Yellow Flash, Geeks and Gamers, and Nerdrotic have responded with a theatrical exuberance that borders on ritualistic, evoking memories of the public vilification of Brie Larson during the promotional cycle for Captain Marvel in 2019. At issue here is not merely disapproval of corporate media output, but the systemic production of antagonists, typically women whose visibility in franchise media becomes a metonym for institutional betrayal. Within this logic, Ziegler is no longer a person, but a placeholder, drafted into an ever-repeating narrative wherein each new femoid is conscripted to represent the latest confirmation that Disney's woke agenda remains unchecked. For content creators who operate within various commentary communities, the existence of cultural tension, real or fabricated, is less a concern than an economic necessity. Conflict, therefore, is not a problem to be resolved, but a resource to be mined. Such performances serve a dual function. First, as entertainment for an audience habituated to outrage, and second, as a stabilizing refrain that affirms the illusion of cultural victory. The paradox, of course, is that while the narrative presupposes a war for civilization itself, it is one in which the terrain remains eerily static. After more than a decade of polemic, little of measurable consequence has shifted, and none of it, it must be said, can plausibly be credited to the interventions of YouTube personalities who declare themselves the vanguard of resistance. This performative triumphalism, however, belies a deeper neurosis, one that calls into question the effective economy of these self-appointed culture warriors. Yellow Flash, for instance, has made no secret of his disdain for Ziegler, dedicating countless hours of commentary to Ziegler. One cannot help but observe a paradox. A man allegedly repulsed by a young actress's words and politics, yet who seems unable to stop invoking her name, dissecting her interviews, and reacting to her facial expressions. To describe this as obsessive may seem flippant, but it is difficult to characterize it otherwise. The pattern may mirror that of a schoolyard bully whose relentless teasing betrays an unspoken attachment. He mocks, derides, and performs disdain, yet his attention never wavers. The line between loathing and longing is thinner than it appears, and when grown men produce hundreds of hours of footage about a woman half their age, ostensibly because they disapprove of her portrayal of a fictional princess, one must ask, what emotional void is this ritual meant to fulfill? Is it typical behavior for a man in his 40s to devote such attention to an actress he claims to despise? One is left to wonder what Rachel Ziegler might make of Flash's own unfolding spectacle. She, the designated antagonist in a narrative not of her own making, observing from a distance as one of her most vocal detractors, is subjected to the very metricized indignity he once held aloft as evidence of cultural triumph. The irony is almost ecclesial in shape. The prosecutor undone not by retribution, but by the logic of his own system. There was a comic book project attached to Yellow Flash which was, by all appearances, supposed to be a triumph of countercultural independence. Originally slated for release in October of 2023, the book is only now emerging. The delay alone would not warrant ridicule were it not for the surrounding controversies. Could a man who had spent years decrying mainstream comics prove himself a capable creator, or even a competent project manager? Complicating matters further, in January of 2024, Yellow Flash severed ties with key sections of his support base. He blocked a number of former customers and shuttered parts of the Comicsgate community page, an action that raised eyebrows and suspicions. Why at the precise moment when he required goodwill and momentum did he choose to alienate his backers? Now lest this be read as an uncritical polemic against one party or another, it is worth attending to the broader context with some measure of fairness. One could reasonably argue that Yellow Flash's comic is, under the current conditions, a qualified success. Within the fragmented landscape of independent comics in 2025, his numbers, while perhaps disappointing by internal expectations, are not only respectable, but in some respects indicative of strategic timing. To begin with, it is unlikely that continued alignment with Comicsgate would have produced markedly better results. The movement, once ascendant on the strength of populist defiance and crowdfunding momentum, now appears to be in statistical decline. A crypto analytics blog dedicated with curious precision to tracking crowdfunding metrics notes that to date, no campaign associated with Comicsgate has crossed the $100,000 threshold in 2025. This is a meaningful benchmark. In prior years, such figures were routinely surpassed. Moreover, the absence of Kickstarter campaigns stemming from what appears to be a self-imposed embargo only further restricts reach. Even the most successful campaign this year, Ethan Van Sciver's Cyberfrog Dark Harvest Last Chance 7 Days, closed at $59,686 and has been beset with refund requests and discontent in its comments section, largely due unfulfilled promises and long delays. In this light, Yellow Flash may have exited at an opportune moment. His withdrawal seems to have coincided not only with the numerical decline of the Comicsgate movement, but also with the shift in tone as Van Sciver escalated his antagonism toward Eric July into a full-time occupation. Whatever the internal calculus, Flash's disengagement could be interpreted not as betrayal, but as adaptation. That all being said, expectations play a crucial role in assessing the campaign's outcome. With his substantial YouTube audience, Flash may have anticipated funding in the range of $500,000. By that metric, the campaign underperformed. Several structural factors, however, complicate the narrative of failure. His audience, while sizable, may not overlap meaningfully with comic book consumers. The independent comics market is saturated, fatigued, and in some cases, demoralized. Pricing on his campaign was comparatively modest, and the lack of visible shipping totals, often included on platforms like Indiegogo, may have understated the apparent success, and launching a project 2 years prior might have yielded stronger results, when the economic and cultural environment was more favorable. At the same time, it is significant that John Della Rose has claimed to have outsold every current Comicsgate creator in 2025. This assertion, corroborated in direct conversation, is more than a personal boast. It may be symptomatic of a broader realignment within the independent comics world. That an outsider to the movement can outperform its central figures suggests not only waning influence, but the erosion of Comicsgate's market distinctiveness. Where once there was cohesion, there is now an unstable landscape of internecine conflict, brand fragmentation, and diminishing returns. Van Sciver's decision to pursue ongoing public antagonism has only accelerated this decline, diverting energy away from creation and towards spectacle. The consequences are not merely reputational, they are economic. Yellow Flash possessed a YouTube subscriber base of approximately 500,000, numerically comparable to that of Eric July. From this, it was widely inferred that Flash would generate similar results in the crowdfunding arena. Eric, for his part, also offered a public defense of the back-end arrangement between Flash and the artist John Dillard, citing risk theory, an appeal not simply to market logic but to a moral economy of ownership. For if one shares in the profits, one must also share in the peril. And in this case, Dillard had agreed to that arrangement. The terms were not foisted upon him, they were entered willingly. This was not a case of exploitation, but of venture. It is tempting in such disputes to reach instinctively for the framework of victim and villain, but not every low outcome is the result of malfeasance. Numbers do not operate in a vacuum, however. For we know that Eric's first campaign raised over $1 million in its first 24 hours, a fact that functions not only as economic data, but as symbolic capital. Eric did not merely sell a product, he inaugurated a movement. His comic book was not presented as an aesthetic offering alone, but as a referendum on legacy publishers, a repudiation of Marvel and DC, and a populist rallying cry. His audience responded in kind, not as consumers, but as co-belligerents. They were not just buying a book, they were underwriting a vision. And as JJ Trujillo rightly noted in a previous video, buying a product is not merely a gesture of desire for new media, but functions more broadly as a war bond in the ongoing culture war economy.
That's good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. My point was, this is why the story is not good.
Dick, the problem is that you attacked his business first. Yeah. And that's why he's not listening to you. The reason why he's not receptive to what you have to say is because you attacked his business first and foremost, and then you went ahead and gave your notes about the book. And so he's mad because you called him a scammer, and you attacked the woke thing, and you do that, and you're going to shut somebody down, and they're not going to listen to you, and that's why he's not receptive to your notes at all, and doesn't give a shit what you have to say. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in right now. So he doesn't want to hear you. And that's,
I understand, and I thank you for letting me on.
Eric still wasn't too happy.
I heard you talking, Ethan, about this whole like this guy in his review or criticism was excellent. That's bullshit.
Yellow Flash attempted to defend Eric, as Dick said Isom's powers weren't clear.
Just off of the book alone, you can assume he has some kind of enhanced strength and like flight.
Eric later said the following.
He explicitly says it in the book. Yeah. He explicitly says it.
Flash, did you
read it? He goes through the internal dialogue.
He literally says in the book that he
this is what I'm talking about with you not being in good faith, because you can't get fundamental things correct. Because you're so mad for whatever reason, angry at myself and the success it is that we saw, and you're shitting on people's friends and customers and all, and going on about this other stuff. And you can't even get fundamental thing wrong. He specifically goes through internal dialogue about him not being able to fly. You claim to have read the book and you couldn't even.
I didn't think he could fly until Flash said he could fly.
It is clear that not only Nina, but Flash didn't read the book. And it raises a question. Was Isom really a story, or is it just political war bonds?
In this framework, the commodity is incidental. What is truly being purchased is not a book, but rather a declaration, a banner under which the consumer enlists. The product becomes sacramental, a visible sign of an invisible allegiance. This explains why campaigns like Eric's are able to mobilize financial capital at rates that seem wildly disproportionate to the quality or scope of the underlying material. The book is not just a book, it is a referendum, a rebuke, a line drawn in the sand. One does not simply read it, one brandishes it. The purchase is performative, and deliberately so. Yellow Flash, by contrast, lacked a clear organizing principle around which to rally support. His campaign, divorced from any galvanizing narrative beyond his established YouTube presence, came across less as a bold new venture and more as a natural outgrowth of his existing content, an echo of familiar antagonisms rather than a meaningful departure from them. The audience he cultivated, to the extent the term audience applies in a commercial sense, was not predisposed to narrative engagement or artistic patronage. They were, and largely remain, participants in a reactive subculture. This is not a condemnation so much as a structural diagnosis. If Eric July's success hinged on symbolic cohesion, a story, a mission, an enemy, then Flash's campaign struggled under the weight of its own diffusion. The attention was present, the numbers were real, but the cohesion was lacking. And this distinction is vital. Outrage may generate clicks, but not commitment. It infiltrates analytics, but does not build foundations. The ability to rally viewers with cultural mockery does not necessarily translate into the ability to mobilize them as financial backers. Flash's metrics, impressive as they were, existed largely within the logic of the algorithm. Fueled by volatility, but not by vision, they responded to the enemy of the day, be it Ziegler, Disney, or whatever the trending controversy happened to be. But when it came time to pivot from critique to creation, many of those voices fell silent. And once again, this is not to say that Yellow Flash's campaign was a failure. In the present crowdfunding climate, saturated, fatigued, and fragmented, selling over 3,000 books is a respectable outcome. But it does suggest that timing and, more importantly, audience conditioning played a decisive role. For the crowd that gathers for spectacle, spectacle does not always stay for substance. And in a media ecosystem where engagement is often mistaken for investment, Flash's campaign may have revealed the limits of strategy built on antagonism.